All right, so we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff you sent over about economic growth and development, especially in less developed countries. I think we're going to uncover some pretty surprising things today.
Absolutely, yeah. And what's so interesting is that so many people just use economic growth and economic development as if they're the same thing. But this document, it makes a really clear distinction between the two.
Yeah, it actually says that economic growth, it's all about like increasing output per worker, right?
Okay.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that society is actually changing all that much.
Yeah, it's like, you're running faster, but you're still kind of stuck in the same place.
Right, like a hamster wheel.
Exactly. But economic development, that implies like real shifts in society, real changes along with those economic gains. For example, they talk about a decrease in agricultural employment, right? And at the same time, a rise in manufacturing or urbanization. That's the kind of thing they're talking about.
Okay, so that distinction, that really helps clear things up. And then the source goes on, it highlights both the advantages and the disadvantages of economic growth and development. Kind of seems like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it really
What
is.
really jumped out at you?
Well, on the one hand, it's so appealing, right? The potential for people's lives to get better and more jobs, that's huge. But at the same time, you can't ignore the risks. Things like increased inequality, where the benefits of this growth don't reach everybody. And of course, environmental damage with all this rapid industrialization. It seems like there's this real need to balance progress with making sure things are sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, like you're trying to navigate a minefield. You
Exactly.
got to be so careful.
Yeah, you really do. And that brings us to, I guess, the main point of this whole deep dive. It's all about trying to understand the really unique challenges that less developed countries face,
Right.
right? Or LDCs.
Right. And the document really paints a very stark picture. It actually uses some pretty strong terms to describe it, like four imbalances and four lacks.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those a bit? What are we talking about here?
Sure. Well, let's start with the imbalances. The first one that comes to mind is it's this imbalanced economy thing. A lot of these LDCs, they're really heavily reliant on agriculture,
Right.
right? And that usually means really low wages and not a lot of opportunities to move up in the world. And then that, of course, leads to problems with education, how much capital they can form, invest. And then that really affects their overall development.
So it's not just about one sector kind of lagging behind. It's about how that imbalance actually holds back progress in so many other areas.
Exactly. Yeah. And then that feeds into the second imbalance.
Yeah.
The imbalanced population structure. You've got a huge proportion of young people, but there just aren't enough opportunities. So all that potential is kind of wasted. And then on top of that, you have a low life expectancy. So there's a real challenge when it comes to developing what they call human capital.
Yeah, it's really a sobering thought when you think about all that potential going to waste. What about the other imbalances?
Well, you've also got this imbalance of wealth distribution. That's a classic issue. A small elite holds most of the wealth.
Yeah.
And that just creates this cycle of poverty that's incredibly difficult to break. And then finally, you have this imbalanced employment structure, which, as we were just talking about, leans really heavily towards agriculture. And that keeps wages low and really limits people's opportunities.
It feels like the system itself is working against progress. So we've got these imbalances, but then there's these four lacks on top of that. What are those?
Okay, so the first one they identify is this lack of education, high illiteracy rates, and a general lack of people with the skills to do the jobs that need to be done. This makes it super hard to attract investment or to create new and innovative things. And then, of course, there's this chronic lack of infrastructure, things that we take for granted, roads, good telecommunications, reliable energy. These are the building blocks of any modern economy. And if you don't have them, it's really hard to get things moving.
Yeah, like trying to build a house without a foundation.
Exactly. And, well, speaking of foundations, there's a huge lack of capital in a lot of these LDCs. People just don't make enough money to save and invest. So that makes it even harder to grow the economy.
Right, it's like a vicious cycle. You need capital to grow, but you need growth to generate that capital.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, to top it all off, there's just a lack of demand. People don't have the money to buy goods and services. So there just aren't enough opportunities for businesses to grow and create new jobs.
So wow, we've got all these imbalances and all these lacks. It just seems like this huge barrier to development. But, the source also mentions that there are even more challenges facing LDCs. What else jumped out at you?
It's true. I mean, the challenges are, well, they're really complex. The document talks about this thing called the poverty trap,
Yeah.
this cycle where people are basically stuck. They're just trying to survive, and they just don't have the resources to do anything to improve their situation.
Yeah, it's like being stuck in quicksand.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The harder you struggle, the worse it gets.
You just sink deeper.
Exactly. And then there's this phenomenon of economic dualism, where you'll see development, but it's only concentrated around certain resources. A lot of times things that are being exported. So other areas, they get completely like behind. You can imagine a country that has this like booming mining industry, right? But then the rest of the population, they don't even have access to clean water. It's pretty crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, it makes me think of those images you see of like these shiny skyscrapers, and then right next to them, these sprawling slums. It's like a visual representation of that economic dualism.
Yeah, it is, exactly. And of course, we can't forget about, unfavorable terms of trade. So many of these LDCs, they export raw materials, but they get such low prices. And then they have to import manufactured goods, and those are super expensive. So they're always at a disadvantage when it comes to global trade.
It's almost like a modern form of colonialism in a way.
Yeah.
Extracting resources, but not really doing anything to help those countries develop in a meaningful way. And what about this high national debt that so many LDCs have? The source really emphasizes how much that holds them back.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, think about it. These countries, they're spending so much money just to pay off their debt. Money that could be used for things like education or healthcare or building infrastructure. The document mentions this crazy statistic that LDCs are sending back like $90 million every single day to wealthy nations just to make debt repayments.
$90 million a day? That's insane.
Yeah, it is.
It's hard to see how they can ever break free from that.
That's the question.
Yeah.
And the document, it doesn't really give like easy answers, but it does suggest this two-pronged approach.
Okay, so what are those two prongs? What do they recommend?
All right, so the first prong is all about the actions that these LDC governments can take themselves. Like one thing that's super important is investing in infrastructure. Things like good transportation networks, power grids that are reliable, communication systems. These are all things that not only make life better for people living there, but they also attract foreign investment and make it easier for businesses to, actually operate. It's like laying the foundation for growth that's going to last.
Right, like building a highway to prosperity.
Exactly. And another really important thing is, promoting political stability and getting rid of corruption. I mean, if businesses don't trust the government, they're not going to invest. If they think things are unstable, they're going to stay away. So it's really about creating an environment where things are predictable, transparent, an environment that gives people confidence.
Right, so it's about building trust, both within the country and internationally.
Exactly. But then there's the second prong, and it's all about what developed countries can do to help.
Right, so what can we do?
Well, the source really emphasizes how important it is for wealthier nations to increase aid. Remember that target that the UN set? Like 0.7% of their GNI? It doesn't sound like much, but it could make a huge difference.
Right, you're talking about official development assistance, ODA.
Yeah, ODA. It's a commitment that these developed nations made to contribute a tiny percentage of their national income to help developing countries. And it really could change everything.
So increased aid, that's one thing. What else can they do?
Well, they can also really push for fair trade practices, making sure that producers and LDCs get fair prices for what they're selling and making sure that trade agreements don't actually end up hurting them. It's all about like leveling the playing field a little bit, making it more of a partnership instead of taking advantage of these countries.
Right, so moving away from that system where the rich get richer and the poor get poor. But we can't ignore this huge issue of debt, right? I mean, the document had some pretty alarming things to say about that.
Yeah, it did. And the source makes a really strong argument that for a lot of these LDCs, debt relief is absolutely essential if they're going to have any chance at developing in a way that's sustainable. I mean, they're using all this money just to service their debt, money that could be going to really important things,
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, it's like $90 million a day that they're sending back. That's just not sustainable.
Exactly. And they actually use this example of Malawi where, get this, 20% of the population is living with HIV. But the country spends more money paying off its debt than it does on healthcare. It's crazy.
It's heartbreaking. So, okay, debt relief is essential. But what can actually be done about it? What are some of the options?
Well, one option is debt cancellation.
Yeah.
Basically just wiping out some or all of a country's debt.
Seems pretty straightforward. Does that actually happen?
It does, but it's usually only for the poorest countries, the ones that are really struggling with the debt. They call them HIPCs, heavily indebted poor countries.
Okay, so that's one option. What about debt restructuring? How does that work?
Well, that's where they change the terms of the loan. So maybe they extend the repayment period
Hmm.
or they reduce the interest rates and give the country some time to breathe, to actually focus on developing their economy.
Got it. And then there are those debt swaps. Can you remind me how those work again?
Oh, sure. So basically, a part of the debt is forgiven. But in exchange, the country agrees to invest in specific things. Maybe it's protecting the environment
Right.
or doing something to reduce poverty. It's kind of a way to use debt relief to make sure some good comes out of it.
So it's like turning a negative into a positive.
Exactly. And the source really emphasizes how these debt relief mechanisms, they're not just charity, they're actually investments, investments in global stability and in shared prosperity.
Right, because when so many people are struggling, it affects all of us. Okay, but let's change gears a bit here. I'm really fascinated by the potential of technology, how it can help drive development in these countries. The source had some really interesting examples of that.
Oh, yeah. There's so much potential there. Think about mobile banking, for example. In a lot of these LDCs, you just don't have the same kind of banking infrastructure that we do. But almost everybody has a cell phone. So these mobile banking platforms, they let people access financial services, send and receive money, even get microloans, all through their phones.
So it's like bypassing the whole need for traditional banks.
Exactly. And it opens up so many possibilities, especially for small businesses and people who've been shut out of the traditional banking system.
Wow, that's really cool. What other examples are there?
Well, technology is really changing how they do agriculture. They're using drones now with all kinds of sensors to monitor crops and make sure they're getting enough water. And precision farming, that can help farmers use things like fertilizer and pesticides way more efficiently. So it's good for their wallets and it's good for the environment.
So they can grow more food with fewer resources.
Exactly. And that's super important, especially with the population growing all the time and, all the problems with climate change. But it's not just agriculture. Think about education. You've got all these online learning platforms, educational apps. They can bring quality education to remote areas where there just aren't enough schools.
Right, so it breaks down those geographical barriers, gives people access to knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah. And let's not forget about healthcare. Telemedicine platforms can connect patients in remote areas with doctors in cities. That can be a lifesaver for people who don't have access to specialists.
It sounds like technology can really change every aspect of life in developing countries.
It can. But we have to be realistic too. Technology is a tool, right? And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a real risk that technology could just make existing inequalities even worse. I mean, if only a few people have access to the internet or to mobile devices, then only those people will benefit from this technology, and everyone else will get left behind.
That's a really important point. It has to be equitable.
Yeah. And sustainability is huge too. We have to make sure that technology is being used in a way that's good for the environment. We don't want to create new problems down the line. Like, think about all the electronic waste, all those old computers and phones. A lot of that ends up in developing countries, and it's a huge environmental hazard.
Right, so it's not just about using technology, it's about using it wisely, responsibly.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that technology isn't a magic solution. It could be a really powerful tool, but it has to be part of a bigger strategy. We have to address the root causes of poverty and inequality, or nothing's going to really change.
So it's about making sure technology is working for us, not the other way around. Okay, so before we finish up this part of our deep dive, there's something that I think often gets overlooked when we talk about economic development, and that's culture. It seems like culture plays a really important role in shaping how things develop.
You're absolutely right. Culture influences everything, from people's attitudes towards work and starting businesses to what they buy and, all their social norms. It can help things move forward or it can hold them back. It's really powerful.
Can you give us some examples? Like, how does culture actually impact development?
Well, think about cultures where there's a strong emphasis on community, on working together. That could be a huge asset because people are already used to collaborating, to achieving common goals. That can make all the difference in development projects.
So it's about tapping into what's already there, the social fabric, the trust.
Exactly. But then, on the other hand, you've got cultures where it's all about the individual. And it can be really hard to get people to work together in those cultures. Those top-down approaches to development, they just don't work as well.
So you have to understand the culture and then find ways to work with it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we have to remember that culture isn't fixed. It's always changing. especially with globalization and technology and everything. So the challenge is to figure out how to take the good parts of a culture and use those, and then find ways to address the parts that might be holding things back.
It's a balancing act, respecting culture, but also trying to encourage positive change.
Precisely. And it really shows that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one place might not work somewhere else.
Right. Every situation is unique.
Yeah. And we have to be willing to learn from what works and what doesn't.
Okay, well, I think we've covered so much in this second part of our deep dive. We've talked about so many strategies for promoting economic development, investing in people, encouraging people to start businesses, using technology in smart ways. We've also talked about how important it is for developed countries to provide aid
Yeah.
and to help with debt relief, and how we have to be sensitive to different cultures.
Yeah, it's been a lot,
Yeah,
and it's been really fascinating.
it has. But our journey isn't over yet. We're going to pick up in the next part of our deep dive, and we're going to take a closer look at some specific examples, some countries that have made amazing progress, and some that are still facing some pretty big obstacles.
I can't wait to see what we find out.
Me too. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back. So in this final part of our deep dive, we're going to take a closer look at some actual countries, see how these theories and strategies play out in the real world.
Yeah, for me, this is the best part. It's one thing to talk about ideas, but seeing how things actually work on the ground, that's what makes it real.
Absolutely. So where should we start? Any countries that really jump out at you?
Well, I always think South Korea's story is just incredible. They went from being one of the poorest countries in the world, right after the Korean War,
Yeah.
to becoming like this global economic powerhouse. And it happened so fast, in just a few decades.
It really is remarkable. I mean, what was their secret? What made them so different?
Well, the document talks about how it's this combination of things. The government had these really strategic policies. They really focused on education and technology. And they also had this culture of really hard work and innovation. It's like they hit on the perfect recipe.
Okay, so tell me more about these government policies. What did they actually do to make this happen?
Well, right after the war, they decided to go all in on exports. They wanted to develop industries that could manufacture goods and sell them to the rest of the world. But it wasn't just about making stuff. They also invested a ton in infrastructure and in education and in technology. So they created this environment where businesses could actually thrive.
So it was a pretty top-down approach. But it sounds like they also really emphasized collaboration, between the government and businesses.
Yeah, totally. The document actually calls it a developmental state, where basically the government and businesses work together towards these shared goals. So it's really strategic and super coordinated.
It makes you wonder if that kind of cooperation is really key, to achieving such fast growth.
It could be. I mean, it's definitely something to think about. And we can't forget that South Korea also got a lot of help from other countries, especially the United States. They gave them a lot of aid and investment.
Right, so they had help from outside, but they also did a lot of the heavy lifting themselves. The document mentions that the South Korean people really embraced education, and they were willing to work hard and adapt to new technologies and industries.
Yeah, they really did. Their work ethic is famous.
Yeah.
And you can see that same drive when you look at how they embraced new technology. They've become world leaders in so many areas, like electronics, automobiles.
It's really a story of hope. It shows that even when countries are facing impossible challenges, they can achieve incredible things.
It does give you hope. But, it's important to look at some other examples, too. Some countries that are facing different kinds of obstacles. Maybe a country in sub-Saharan Africa. That region has had a really hard time when it comes to development.
Yeah, you're right. What about Ethiopia? It's a country with this rich history, but it's also had its share of problems, progress, and then setbacks.
Yeah, and the document is honest about the challenges they've faced. Like a lot of countries in that region, they've struggled with poverty, famine, conflict, political instability. These are issues that have been around for a long time. It's hard to overcome them.
Yeah, it's like trying to run a race with weights strapped to your ankles. Has Ethiopia made any progress?
They have. The source mentions that there are some positive signs. They've actually had some pretty good economic growth lately because they've been investing in infrastructure, agriculture, manufacturing, and the government's been trying to attract foreign investment and to encourage people to start their own businesses.
So they are doing some things right.
Yeah, definitely. But,
Huh.
despite that progress, they still have a long way to go. Poverty rates are still high. There's a lot of inequality, a lot of unemployment. It's just a reminder that development takes time. There are no quick fixes.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. You just have to keep moving forward. And be willing to change your strategy as things change.
Exactly. And learn from what other countries have done, both the good and the bad.
Right. And speaking of learning from others, let's talk about the role of the international community. We've talked about aid and debt relief, but what else can developed countries do to help?
One thing that's super important is promoting good governance. Helping to build strong institutions, fighting corruption, making sure human rights are being protected. Those are the things that really matter.
Yeah, if you don't have that strong foundation, it's really hard to make progress.
Exactly. It's about creating a fair system where everyone has a chance to succeed. And of course, developed countries can help by promoting peace and security. That's essential for development. Things like supporting peacekeeping missions, providing humanitarian aid, trying to find peaceful solutions to conflicts.
Right. We're all connected. What happens in one part of the world affects us all.
Yeah, for sure. And we can't forget about climate change. That's a huge issue, and it's hitting developing countries the hardest. Developed countries have to take the lead in reducing emissions and in helping developing countries adapt to the changes that are already happening.
It's about taking responsibility for our actions
Yeah.
and for helping others.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about working together to build a better world for everyone.
Well, I think we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We started by defining what economic development actually means. Then we talked about the challenges and the solutions. And we looked at some real-world examples. It's been quite a journey.
It has. I've learned a lot.
And before we go, I want to leave our listener with this thought. Economic development isn't just about numbers. It's about people. It's about making the world a better place for everyone. A place where everyone has the chance to live a good life.
That's a great way to put it. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging in these important conversations. Because your voice matters, and your ideas can make a difference.
So keep diving deep.